I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, I'm delighted to welcome you all here to today's online lecture. I'm Lynn Ransom, and I'm the curator of programs at the Schoenberg Institute. And I'm here with my colleague, Dot Porter, our curator of digital research services. Today's online lecture is presented by Meagan Allen, and I'll be introducing her in just a minute. But before I do that, I just have a few announcements and some housekeeping items to share. I want to remind everyone about the next online lecture. On April 14th, we'll be welcoming Andrew Turner of the Getty Research Institute. He'll be speaking on the scholarly controversies surrounding the earliest known Mayan manuscript, now known as the Códice Maya de México. And this manuscript was recently the focal point of an exhibition at the Getty, and I think hearing about his experiences with that exhibition and the research done on that book will be really interesting. I'll paste a link to that in the chat for more information and to register. If you're joining us for the first time and you're curious about previous lectures in the series, you can find the recordings on our SIMS YouTube channel. We have an online lecture playlist. And if you're interested in following updates on this series and other events, I encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter if you haven't already. You can find links to the newsletter sign up and to our YouTube playlist by visiting our website at theschoenberginstitute.org, where you can also find more information about other programs that we have, including our Visiting Research Fellowship. And I hope some of you will be interested to know that we've just opened the call for applications for the 2023-2024 fellowships. And these fellowships bring scholars here for a month to use our collections and participate in the life at SIMS and the Kislek Center at Penn Libraries. These applications are due on May 15th. And if you have any questions about the fellowship, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask. And I can put my contact info in the chat to help you find me. So turning now to the lecture, I want to remind everyone that we'll be taking questions at the end, and Dot will be acting as the moderator. If you have questions along the way, please go ahead and type them in the chat. And at the end of the lecture, we'll pass those questions along to our speaker. And you're, of course, welcome to ask your questions directly at the end. And we ask that you use the raise hand icon so that we know that you have a question. I also want to remind you that we're recording this lecture and we will be posting it to the YouTube channel in due course once we get the transcription cleaned up and edited. So, as I mentioned, our speaker today is Meagan Allen. Dr. Allen is a historian of medieval science and is currently the Kane Postdoctoral Fellow at the Science History Institute here in Philadelphia. Her research focuses on the intersection of alchemy and medicine, particularly in the writings of the 13th century Franciscan scholar Roger Bacon. Dr. Allen completed her PhD at Indiana University in 2021 and has held visiting fellowships at Corpus Christi College in Oxford and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. In addition to several articles on the history of alchemy, Dr. Allen has just published in the last few weeks her first monograph entitled Roger Bacon and the Incorruptible Human, 1220 to 1292, Alchemy, Pharmacology, and the Desire to Prolong Life, in which she examines Bacon's alchemical and medical theories for insights into the natural philosopher's belief that the study and principles of speculative alchemy were more critical to extending human life than what was taught in the medical faculties in the universities. Her study and reassessment of his writings as presented in this book promise to bring new insights and approaches into Bacon's oeuvre and to the beginnings of modern medicine, insights that I'm sure will be of interest to many of you here. Today, she will be turning her attention to the material witnesses of Bacon's writings, the manuscripts, of course, in her talk entitled Paleographical Approaches to Determining the Authenticity of Medieval Alchemical Manuscripts. So Meagan, I hand the Zoom screen over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Dot. And thank you to the Schoenberg for allowing me to present. I'm really happy to be here today. So I will share my screen. Let's see. All right, everyone can see that? Yes? Okay, good. So in today's talk, I will address the authenticity of a work commonly attributed to Bacon, the Epistola de Secretis Operibus Artis et Naturae et de Nullitate Magiae, henceforth the Epistola. Using a three-tiered approach of placement, content, and themes, I argue that the Epistola is possibly a genuine work of Roger Bacon's. Without a reference to the Epistola in Bacon's known works in which he claims authorship, or an extant copy in Bacon's own hand, it is impossible to claim with absolute certainty that it was written by Bacon. However, the evidence weighs more heavily in favor of it being a genuine work, or at the very least, written by someone soon after his death who was familiar with large sections of his work. The Epistola, occasionally called De Mirabili Potestate Artis et Naturae, is a text consisting of 11 chapters, each of which deals with the marvelous things that man can create using art to surpass nature. The chapters and contents are as follows. Chapter 1, De et contra apparentias fictas et de et contra invocatione spirituum, deals with the differences between art, nature, and magic. Art can surpass nature, but magic is to be shunned, for it is either nothing more than conjuring tricks or demonic summonings. Chapter 2, De Characteribus Carminibus et de Aurum Usu, deals with how figures and charms can be made and used. In this chapter, Bacon describes how charms can be used to comfort patients and provide them with hope, much like the modern placebo effect. Chapter 3, De Virtute Sermonis et de Redargatione Magiae, is on the propagation of species and how they can have demonstrable effects in nature, such as the horse that becomes impregnated by the scent of a male of its species. Bacon had interesting ideas on how nature worked. Chapter 4, De Instrumentis Artificiosis Mirabilibus, which lists the miraculous machines that can be made using art, like a self-pulling chariot and flying machines. Chapter 5, De Experientis Perspectivis Artificialibus, which concerns mirages that can be created, such as that which tricks an army into believing that the enemy is much greater in size than it really is. Chapter 6, De Experimentis Mirabilibus, which deals with perpetual lamps and burning weapons like malta and naphtha. Here, the author also discusses more strange natural phenomena, such as the attraction of iron to a lodestone and the creation of invaluable astronomical instruments. Chapter 7, De Retardatione Accidentium Senectutis et de Prolongatione Vitae Humanae, which is concerned with how human life has been shortened since the fall of man and recounts certain instances of men, such as the legendary Artephius, who have used the powers of art and nature to extend their lives past the standard 80 years. We can also learn from wild animals who use stones and herbs to prolong their lives. It is in this chapter that the author again makes the claim that man potens non mori, or has the ability of not dying. Chapter 8, De Occultando Secreta Naturae et Artis, discusses the different ways in which groups of philosophers have tried to conceal knowledge from the public. Chapter 9, De Modo Faciendae Ovum Philosophorum, tells how to make the philosopher's egg, beginning from calx and alkaline waters. Chapter 10, De Eodum sed alio modo, is another way to prepare the substance, which the author here refers to as the, quote, medicine or laxative medicine. And finally, chapter 11, De Eodum tamen alio modo, is one last way of creating the philosopher's egg. So given the unusual nature of the last three chapters, scholars have debated the authenticity of the Epistola for the past century. In 1861, Emile Charles argued that the attribution of this work was suspect, especially the last three chapters, attached to Bacon's name only after his death, while John Bridges' 1914 work, The Life and Work of Roger Bacon, claimed that all 11 chapters of the Epistola were genuine. Today, there are three large schools of thought. The first is that the entirety of the epistola is genuine. The second is that the entire work is spurious, but was written by someone very familiar with Bacon's genuine works and philosophies. And the third, that chapters 1 through 8 are genuine, but chapters 9 through 11 were a later addition written by someone else who was familiar with Bacon's work, but the chapters are not representative of his own thinking. This has been the view adopted by many scholars of medieval science and alchemy, most notably Dorothea Singer and Lynn Thorndike. In recent years, other scholars have reevaluated this argument. These chapters, especially chapter 9, contain references to works that Bacon is known to have written, such as the gloss on the Secretum Secretorum and part of the Opus Minus that deals with alchemy. It is of particular importance that the authenticity of this epistola be established. Sebastian Moreau has argued that there is a link between this philosopher's egg of the last 3 chapters, which appears in both Bacon's edition of the Secretum Secretorum and the epistola, and the Gloria Inestimabilis, the miraculous medicine that Bacon says has the ability to prolong human life. This is especially important given the debates about what the philosopher's egg actually is. Now, scholars have also argued about the identification of this philosopher's egg. Famously, Lieutenant Colonel Heim tried to argue in 1914 that the last 3 chapters of the epistola were a cipher that described the creation of gunpowder. Heim went so far as to claim that Bacon was the originator of gunpowder in Europe. However, Thorndike observed that there were serious flaws with this argument, including the fact that Bacon already speaks of gunpowder by name in the Opus Tertium, where he describes it as being used in children's toys. If Bacon had invented gunpowder, Thorndike says, then the epistola would have to predate the Opus Tertium, although there is no evidence that it was produced that early in his career. Additionally, Heim's argument that Bacon wrote about gunpowder in cipher to protect himself from the Inquisition does not stand up to the test. There would be no reason for the Inquisition or the Church to ban so practical an invention. There's also the fact that if Bacon had invented gunpowder, he would obviously, or not obviously, but he would most certainly have credited himself with the discovery in the Opus Tertium. Bacon was never shy about talking about his own discoveries. So in the Secretum Secretorum, Pseudo-Aristotle provides a recipe for this so-called philosopher's egg, although the purpose of this substance is not explicit. However, in the epistola, Bacon notes that the philosopher's egg has the marvelous ability to cure fevers and passions through its equality of complexion. The philosopher's egg invokes the idea that a corpus equale, or a body made of equal proportions of the 4 elements, can prevent corruption and decay. And the idea of a corpus equale is central to Bacon's program of the prolongation of human life. Now, it has been argued that this notion of equal proportions is partially what gives Bacon the idea for his alchemical medicines and their wonderful abilities to cure disease. Given the importance of both the idea of equal proportions to Baconian medicine and the intriguing suggestion that alchemical medicines may have been conceived from Bacon's understanding of the philosopher's egg, it is vital that we establish the authenticity of the epistola. It may also help shed light on how Bacon, if he was in fact the author of the last 3 chapters, intended the philosopher's egg to be used. Laxatives and other purgatives occasionally play a role in his medicine, such as in Bacon's De Auroribus Medicorum. Is the philosopher's egg then meant to be used literally as a laxative medicine, or is it an obfuscation referring to something else? These questions can only really be answered by determining whether the epistola was written by Bacon. The epistola is known to exist in 11 manuscript copies, all of which are attributed to Roger Bacon and date from between the 13th and 16th centuries. There are 2 other manuscripts that I'll mention briefly as well: Ambrosiana Supplement Z517 and Bibliotheca Palatina 11314. Ambrosiana Supplement Z517, housed in the Veneranda Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan, does not appear in any published lists of the epistola manuscripts. It appears in the catalog under the title of Fratris Rogeri Baconis Anglici de Mirabili Potestate Artis et Naturae Libellus. However, after a careful examination of this manuscript, I've determined that it is not a medieval or early modern manuscript at all. Rather, it is a modern copy made in the late 1930s. Thus, we can exclude it from any further discussion of the epistola's authenticity. Additionally, manuscript Bibliotheca Palatina 11314 of the Austrian National Library, listed in A.G. Little's Roger Bacon Essays, is not an edition of the epistola. The title of the work is Tractatis Rogeri Baconis de Secretissimis Naturae Mysteriis Supercoelestis, and the body of the text is in German. This is not a case of a misnaming or a later German translation of the epistola. The contents are very different from that of the epistola. So for this reason, I've also removed it from further consideration. Thus, the 11 partial and complete manuscript copies of the epistola and their corresponding sigla are as follows. C, Cambridge University Library 1255, FM, Fitzwilliam Museum, Maclean 153, L, Leiden, Bibliothek Universiteit Bosniani Chimici, LH, London, British Library, Harley 3528, LS, British Library, Sloane 2156, OD, Bodleian Library, Digby 164, OT, Bodleian Library, Tanner 116, OM, Oxford Merton College 230, P, Vescoville 18, R, Bibliotheca Apostolica, excuse me, Vaticana Vat Latini 4091, and RC, Collegio San Bonaventura 1. According to their manuscript catalogs, the earliest manuscripts are OT and OM, both dating from the 14th century and housed in Oxford. OT has been previously listed as being from the 13th century. However, I suspect that it is in fact a later manuscript from at least the 14th century, as it appears to derive from OM, which is itself a 14th century work. So OT and OM contain exactly the same content, the full text of chapters 1 through 5, and then the first few lines of chapter 6. There seems to be little reason why the text drops off here. The break occurs between the section of the chapter where Bacon discusses war instruments like Greek fire and how armies can create artificial thunder and lightning to frighten their enemies. This is neither a case of a text that has been rebound into a new manuscript, nor a case of missing folios, for both texts are immediately followed on the same folio by a new text. The scribe deliberately ended in that place and started up a new text. So the most obvious explanation for this is that the exemplar that scribe was using was itself incomplete. The 14th century manuscript R is the first version of the epistola to contain all 11 chapters, followed chronologically by RC, which also contains all 11 chapters. RC is unique, however, in that it is the only copy of the epistola which is not in a larger codex with other texts and is bound on its own. The 15th century OD is the earliest manuscript that contains the first 8 chapters of the epistola and does not include the strange chapters 9 through 11. While this could suggest that chapters 9 through 11 are not genuine, the fact that 2 previous manuscripts from the 14th to 15th centuries do have these chapters provides counter evidence. The other 15th century manuscripts contain a wide range of material. FM contains only the first 6 chapters, while LS contains all 11 chapters. The most unusual of the 15th century manuscripts is LH. The top is dated Oxford, 1715, but the hand does not match that of the actual text, which the manuscript catalog dates to the 15th century. This version contains chapters 9 through 11 and the last paragraph of chapter 8. So the final cluster of manuscripts are from the 16th century, C, L, and P, all of which contain all 11 chapters. C is almost identical to the 17th century printed version made from John Dee's copy, and is unique in that we know the copyist, one Robert Green of Welby, who completed this manuscript between 1528 and 1529. L also contains all 11 chapters and only a few variations from the other manuscripts. P, though containing all 11 chapters, has a demarcation between chapters 7 and 8, with chapters 8 through 11 designated as tractatus. It also has additional material not found in any of the other versions, and a few paragraphs are out of order, and I'll get to the exact nature of this material in a moment. As none of the extant copies of the Epistola are in Bacon's hand, an analysis of even the earliest copy's handwriting will not be useful in establishing the authenticity of the text. Instead, authenticity is based on an examination of three aspects of the manuscripts: common themes, content, and placement. Common themes concern those ideas that are found in both the Epistola manuscripts and Bacon's other alchemical and medical writings, such as De Auroribus Medicorum and the gloss on Pseudo-Aristotle's Secretum Secretorum. Such themes include the ability of certain materials to prolong life and how human life has come to be shortened. The examination of content consists of a line-by-line close reading of each of the extant Epistola manuscripts for additions, deletions, and variations among texts. Finally, the study of placement involves an inspection of the larger codex in which the texts are contained. For many years, scholars assumed that three works were written by Bacon solely on their placement in manuscripts. These three texts, De Balneis Senum et Seniorum, De Universali Regimine Senum et Seniorum, et De Compositione Quarundam Medicinarum, were all found in manuscripts after a supposed Baconian work, De Retardatione Accidentium Senectutis, and thus were thought to be appendices of it. Once Agostino Paravicini Baliani suggested that De Retardatione was itself not genuinely Baconian, the authorship of the other three works immediately came into question. I bring this up to show that there is good precedent for examining the placement and location of texts within a manuscript to determine its authenticity. So Paravicini Baliani has argued that based on their placement next to an almost certainly spurious text, the three shorter texts that were often attributed to Bacon are probably not genuine. Indeed, the other items in an entire manuscript can tell us a great deal about the intention and the interest of the copiers. Three questions may be asked regarding placement. One, are there other genuine works written by Bacon in any of the manuscripts in question? Two, are there other spurious works attributed to Bacon? And three, do the manuscripts contain other works on either alchemy or medicine? An examination of the manuscripts revealed that there was no universal answer to these questions, the results of which I've summarized on this table. There also seems to be no relationship between the answers to the questions. For instance, a manuscript that contains copies of several works by Bacon was not more or less likely to contain other alchemical or medical material than one that only contained the copy of the Epistola. Nor was the attribution of texts, spurious or genuinely Baconian, of particular importance. There also seems to be little correlation to the date of composition. The earliest work of the 11 contains other genuine works by Bacon, while the second oldest contains no other works by Bacon. So 6 manuscripts contain other authentic works by Bacon, including his edition of the Secretum Secretorum in OT and the Perspectiva and De Multiplicatione Speciarum in LS. 5 manuscripts contain works erroneously attributed to Bacon, and 2, LH and C, both later manuscripts, contain both spurious and genuine works. So regarding the question of whether these manuscripts also contain other alchemical or medical texts, again, there is no universal answer. 7 contain other alchemical works, while only 3 contain additional medical texts. The outliers are OT, which contains expositions on Aristotle and Albertus Magnus, and LS, which contains mostly works on mathematics and physics. So now we have to move to content. As demonstrated from this table, not all versions of the epistola contain the entire work, and there is some variation in each, both in terms of language and in terms of demarcating the chapters. The comparisons provided here will demonstrate that Singer and Thorndike's argument that the last 3 chapters of the epistola are spurious, while the remainder is genuine, is a highly unlikely theory. While most of the chapters are uniform throughout the versions, following the format provided at the beginning of this talk, there are a few manuscripts that deviate from this pattern. Certain texts, though they do contain all the material, do not demarcate between chapters. Those that do have different methods of doing so. For instance, P, while containing all 11 chapters, does have a demarcation between chapters 7 and 8. Chapters 8 through 11 are titled Tractatus. RC does not provide any divisions between chapters 1 and 3, but does so for the rest of the material. In this text, chapter 6 is in itself divided into 2 parts, the second of which includes all of chapter 7. So thus chapter 7 is not technically its own chapter in this version. The beginning of this section is marked by a marginal note reading Prolongatio Vitae. And like chapter 6, chapter 9 is also split into 2 sections. OD is similar to RC in that both chapter 6 is split into 2 and chapter 7 is incorporated into the second half of chapter 6, and the earliest chapters do not have any demarcations between them. LS has separate headings for chapters 1, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, and 11. L also does not demarcate between chapters 1 and 3, but does so for the rest. The 2 earliest works, OT and OM, contain no separations between chapters. So there's a lot of difference. And the 2 points that appear from this examination, there are 2 points that appear from this examination of chapter divisions. The first is that chapters 1 through 3 are often viewed as a single chapter. And the second is that chapter 7 is occasionally incorporated into the second half of chapter 6. Of the 2 points, I think the second is more significant in terms of our argument. It could be important that chapters 1 through 3 are often combined, but the earliest versions do not have any chapter divisions and only include chapters 1 through 6. So there's no argument to be made for or against authenticity on the basis of this alone. The argument that just chapters 1 through 6 are genuine is highly unlikely, given the similarities between chapters 6, 7, and 8, and the genuine works of Roger Bacon. Regarding the second point, if we return, we will see that chapter 6 discusses marvelous experiments, such as perpetual lamps, weapons of war, astronomical instruments, and occult natural phenomena. At first, this doesn't really seem to be relevant to the prolongation of life, the subject of chapter 7. But there are 2 places in the genuine Bacon's works where these marvelous experiments appear alongside the prolongation of life. The section of the Opus Maius that deals with experimental science, and the Liber Sextientiarum. The Liber Sextientiarum discusses how experimental science, optics, perspectiva, and alchemy can make instruments that can be used to prolong human life with the aid of celestial rays. The comparison between the Opus Maius and the Epistola is even more concrete. The chapter on the second prerogative of experimental science in the Opus Maius includes 3 examples: mathematical science, the prolongation of life, and alchemy. The contents of these examples are almost identical to the material found in chapters 6 and 7 of the Epistola. Even much of the wording is the same. The main difference is that the contents of the Epistola, chapter 6, correspond to Opus Maius examples 1 and 3, mathematics and alchemy, while chapter 7 is the same as example 2, meaning that the sections would be slightly out of order in the Epistola if they were copied from the Opus Maius. However, much of this text is verbatim, which is not unusual for Bacon. As many of his works were rewritten at various points throughout his life, it's not unusual to find sections copied word for word in one text into another. Now, there are some differences between the text of the epistola and the examples. Most notably, the epistola does not state that there is a connection between the ability to heal metals and the ability to heal the human body. This is something that is found in the genuine works of Roger Bacon. However, this may not be evidence that the epistola is not a genuine work. Bacon's ideas surrounding the relative importance of alchemy in the Prolongatio Vitae are not always consistent. In the Opus Maius, it appears that Bacon does not consider alchemy to be an especially important science for the prolongation of life. In the Liber Sexcientiarum, however, alchemy is much more important. Overall, the comparisons of Exempla 1 and 3 and the Epistola provides evidence in support of the theory that this is a genuine work of Roger Bacon's. Other parts of the Epistola also correspond with Bacon's genuine works, and I'll get to these in a moment. Now, on the whole, the contents of the 11 extant manuscripts of the Epistola are very similar. Indeed, many of the significant differences occur not between the text versions themselves, but between the manuscript versions and the printed versions. There are several printed editions. The best scholarly one, despite certain shortcomings, is included as an appendix to Brewer's edition of the Opus Minus, Opus Tertium, and Compendium Studii Philosophiae, published in 1859. Although there are several early printed editions from the 17th and 18th centuries as well. Brewer's edition is based on several manuscript versions, which he refers to as C, MS, H, and a base manuscript. Unfortunately, Brewer does not identify which of the manuscripts correspond to which versions. However, I'm able to shed some light on this. The textual variations among the manuscripts have allowed me to narrow down the candidates to two or three for each manuscript. Brewer's C is either manuscript L, R, or P. Brewer's MS is either R or P. Brewer's H has only a few variations from the base manuscript, so it is almost impossible to identify. Finally, Brewer's base manuscript is either L, C, or one of the early printed versions. I say the base may be a printed text because the base reads pluribus rather than potentatibus, in chapter 7. This is rare among the manuscripts. Almost all read potentatibus. You can see where I've highlighted this on the screen in red. However, almost all of the printed versions read pluribus. So as I'll demonstrate later, the last three chapters of the epistola contain many decnomen or code names. Two of these are particularly striking, Ossa Adai in chapter 11 and Mea Longitudinis Statura in chapter 9. No scholar has been able to determine what each of these decnomen refer to. The Ossa Adai, or the bones of Adam, had the potential to be significant given the role that Adam plays in Bacon's understanding of the prolongation of life. Is Ossa Adai therefore somehow a reference to man's potential for immortality? Now, despite the numerous references to Adam in the genuine works of Bacon, he never refers to his bones, perhaps suggesting that this chapter is not genuine. However, despite appearing as Ossa Adai in every one of the printed versions examined, this is not actually what the manuscripts read. 6 of the 7 manuscripts that contain this chapter do not read Ossa Adai, but rather omnibus et, significantly changing the meaning of the sentence. However, there is the possibility that omnibus et is itself a mistake from an earlier copy. Without the original manuscript, it is impossible to tell if this is an example of lectio difficilor potior, the principle of textual criticism, which states that in the case of variations among manuscripts, the more unusual reading is likely the original. According to this principle, when faced with unusual or unfamiliar words and phrases, scribes would replace them with more common alternatives. Thus, Ossa Adai could be the correct interpretation and was only replaced with omnibus et at a later date. Determining which alternative, if either, is the correct one is going to require more work. There are many other variations between most of the manuscripts and the printed versions, although they are generally less significant in terms of identifying a potential author for the epistola. For instance, almost all manuscripts that contain chapter 7 state that rural men who live without the aid of doctors regularly live to be 160, while many printed versions change this to 100. In his other works on the prolongation of life, Bacon does not specify an age to which the rural people tend to live, only stating that they live longer lives. So this provides no additional information as to whether the epistola is genuine. Also in chapter 7, most manuscripts read utum potentatibus vivant homines, while as a rule men live 80 years, while most print versions read utum pluribus vivant homines, while many men live 80 years. Both versions are in accord with Bacon's thought, but the first is a bit more fitting with his idea that life has progressively shortened over time. This is a central idea in Bacon's Alchemical Medicine. There are also significant variations among the manuscripts themselves. Aside from certain manuscripts ending at the beginning of chapter 6, the variations between the extant copies are largely minor. Most are some form of word swapping. Most manuscripts will have one word, such as elementorum, but one or two of the manuscripts will have a different word like oliorum. Another example is hominum instead of ovum. A second type of variation is the addition or deletion of a phrase. Such phrases, usually not the main clause of the sentence, are found in some manuscript versions, but not in others. Two of the most common are found in chapter 7. Only two manuscripts, LH and C, add a description of Mulsum to the story of a man who lived during the time of Octavius Augustus by anointing himself with oil, while 5 do not. Two manuscripts omit the phrase lapsi ab originali justitia from the discussion of man's potential to be immortal, RC and LS. And a third variation comes from chapter 6, in which certain manuscripts include petrolio albo to the list of flammable materials used in war. The date at which the manuscripts were written doesn't seem to be a factor in determining whether or not they will have these variations. Now, the final type of variations are those larger sections, greater than one sentence, that are either moved to a different location in the manuscript or omitted entirely. As a whole, these are unique to the manuscript that contains them and thus do not provide much information for establishing authenticity. So the most obvious of these are OM, OT, and FM, which contain only the first 5 chapters and the first few lines of chapter 6. In the same category is OD, which contains only the first 8 chapters. Other variations include P, which has entire paragraphs out of order, and R, which omits a significant piece of chapter 6, while simultaneously including a paragraph in chapter 1 that is not found anywhere else. So an examination of the contents of the extant copies as a whole suggests that Thorndike and Singer's argument that chapters 1 through 8 are genuine, while 9 through 11 are spurious, may not be correct. If all of the early copies contained exactly chapters 1 through 8, with chapters 9 through 11 appearing only centuries after Bacon's death, then it would make a stronger, though of course not absolute, case against their authenticity, thus supporting Singer and Thorndike's argument. And while it is true that the earliest two manuscripts do not include these last 3 chapters, they also don't include chapters 7 and 8, which Singer and Thorndike considered to be genuine. Thus, there's no direct evidence to support the ideas that chapters 1 through 8 are genuine and that 9 through 11 are spurious. Of course, this is entirely dependent upon the extant manuscripts. I have to restate that the original manuscript appears to no longer be with us, and thus all of the surviving copies are just that, they're copies. So, using the information provided by the examination of content, the manuscript variations, and especially those between the manuscript tradition as a whole and the printed versions, demonstrates that there's no good reason to assume that the epistola is not genuine. Additionally, based on the variations within the manuscripts, it is possible to create a stemma. The original manuscript, Alpha, is no longer extant. It likely contained all 11 chapters and included the stories about the man who extended his life during the reign of Octavius Augustus and the additional information on the preparation of mulsum. The remaining descendants of Alpha form 3 families: Beta, which contains manuscripts OM and R and their descendants, FM, OT, P, and L, respectively, Gamma with manuscripts LH and C, and finally RC and its descendants, LS and OD. Each family has one piece that is not found in the other 2. Family Beta contains the information on Petrolio Albo. Family RC has the story of Octavius Augustus, and Family Gamma has the information on the preparation of mulsum. The manuscripts were placed into the 3 families based on which of the 3 stories they contained. They were then further organized based on internal variations. Apart from the 3 stories discussed above, I also considered whether the manuscript read Feces Elementorum or Feces Oleorum, Omnibus or Ossa Adi, Melancholia or Mea Longitudina, Pluribus or Tentatibus, whether men lived for 70 or 80 years, and so forth. I won't bother you with all of these variations that I've used. The most reliable of the manuscripts are thus OM, LH, C, and RC, and any critical edition, one of which I'm planning, should rely heavily on these manuscripts. R and its descendants are unfortunately unreliable, for they contain many inaccuracies and large sections of the text are out of order. Themes offers potentially the best way of determining the epistola's authenticity. Previous scholarship has demonstrated that the contents of the epistola are very similar to a number of Bacon's genuine works, especially the Opus Minus. In fact, William Newman has argued that the main difference between the epistola and the relevant sections of the Opus Minus is not theoretical, but practical. The epistola gives more practical techniques on how to perform alchemical work, such as the separation of fat using water, vinegar, and urine. However, there are more examples of where the contents of the epistola match up with other parts of Bacon's corpus. So chapter 6 and chapter 7 of the epistola are very similar to exempla 1 through 3 of experimental science in part 6 of the Opus Maius, as I've already said. These correspond to the power of mathematics, the prolongation of human life, and alchemy, respectively. Earlier chapters of the epistola are also found elsewhere in the Opus Maius, especially in part 4. Sections of the epistola can also be found in the Compendium Studii Philosophiae, the Communia Naturalium, the Opus Minus, and the section of the Opus Minus contained in manuscript Reg Lat 1317, the Liber Sextientiarum, and the Secretum Secretorum, both the main text by pseudo-Aristotle and the glosses that Bacon wrote. Some themes are broad, such as the ability of art to supplement or complete nature, or the possibility of prolonging human life. However, some are quite specific. In both the Compendium Studii Philosophiae and the Epistola, there is a story of how parrots can mimic human voices, thus demonstrating that speech does not necessarily require intelligence. The Opus Maius and the Epistola both cite Averroes' claim against Galen that equality of potency prevents corruption. However, the best evidence in support of the authenticity of the Epistola is found in the Opus Tertium in the chapter entitled De Scientia Quinta Essentia, which, despite its name, has nothing to do with the quintessence. Rather, this chapter is a condensed version of the material found in chapters 1 through 6 of the Epistola. It would thus seem that the Epistola is an expanded version of the material that Bacon put in the Opus Tertium, to which he added more on the prolongation of life and the practical methods by which to make the philosopher's egg. This is not a stretch. Bacon spent much of his career reworking the material that he had already written, abridging it or expanding upon it to fit the need of whatever text he was currently working on. So the following is a comparison of the contents found in both the Epistola and Bacon's known works. I'm not going to say that, or I should say, not every idea in the Epistola is found elsewhere in the genuine works of Bacon. Most notably, the contents of chapter 4 is not found elsewhere in the works of Bacon. However, given the number of passages of the Epistola that correlate to a wide range of Bacon's known works, there is much evidence to support the theory that the Epistola is genuine, or at least a compilation of the ideas found in his genuine works made by one of his followers. So I won't read all the quotes out to you, but I have a couple of slides just to show how the quotes match up. You can see the Epistola and then the relevant texts which have similar ideas. So this idea is found in the Epistola in chapter 7. It's also found in the Opus Maius, Opus Minus, and Opus Tertium. This idea found in the Epistola chapter 9 is found in 2 chapters in the Opus Tertium, one at the beginning of the text and one at the end of the text. This idea on the resolution to prime matter found in Epistola chapter 11 is found in the Opus Minus, twice in the Opus Tertium, and once in the Communia Naturalium. Finally, this idea found in chapter 11 is found in the Opus Maius, the Communia Naturalium, and Bacon's gloss on the Secretum Secretorum. Now, in addition to the broad themes, I've also surveyed the specific deknomen found in chapters 9 through 11. Alchemical authors often use deknomen, or code words, to obfuscate the true meanings of their works. A comparison of all the deknomen and alchemical terms found in the final 3 chapters of the Epistola to those found in Bacon's genuine works are summarized below. Deknomen found elsewhere are in black text with their associated texts, while those unique to the Epistola are printed in red. A high correlation between the deknomen used in Bacon's genuine works and those in the Epistola would support the argument of the Epistola's authenticity, especially if they are used to represent the same ideas and substances. As you can see from this slide, over 2/3 of the deknomen do appear elsewhere in Bacon's genuine works, and almost all of them mean the same thing in the Epistola as they do in the genuine work. Additionally, they are found in a selection of his works, not just 1 or 2. This lends support to the argument that this could be a genuine work of Bacon's, as the author of the Epistola would have to have been familiar with a large portion of Bacon's work on alchemy. However, it does not discount the theory that a later follower of Bacon's compiled the Epistola from the material found in Bacon's genuine works. Additional support for the argument that the Epistola is a genuine work of Bacon's is provided by the sources it utilizes. The 11 chapters of the Epistola contain references to 29 works from 16 authors. All 16 of these authors can be found elsewhere in Bacon's genuine corpus. All 16 can be found in the Opus Maius, and 14 of the 16 are found in at least 2 works by Bacon. Authors who write on broad topics, such as Josephus and Pliny the Elder, are referenced in no less than 6 works by Bacon. Regarding the citations to specific works, 22 of the 29 are referenced elsewhere in Bacon's works. Additionally, the majority of the specific ideas referenced in the Epistola appear elsewhere in Bacon's corpus. For example, the Epistola's reference to Solinus's De Mirabilibus Mundi, in which he says that female horses can occasionally become impregnated through the scent of a male horse, is also found in the Opus Maius. The consistency of these citations across Bacon's corpus, especially those that occur in Bacon's more specialized works, such as De Auroribus Medicorum and De Multiplicatione Speciarum, suggests that the author of the Epistola, if not Bacon himself, was very familiar with many of Bacon's works. So this table contains a list of the 16 authors cited in the Epistola and the other places in Bacon's genuine works where they appear. However, this information is still not enough to determine whether the Epistola was actually written by Bacon or if it was just a later compilation by someone very familiar with his work. If it were a compilation, it would only make sense that the sources would be the same. So this, again, does not provide concrete evidence. Now, it is possible, as I've said, that the Epistola was a later work written by someone who was intimately acquainted with Bacon's works, especially the 3 Opera and the Communia Naturalium. However, if we apply the principle of parsimony, The simplest answer is that the Epistola is a genuine work of Roger Bacon's and is an example of his reuse of materials and ideas in different ways throughout his career. Reviewing the evidence provided by the three topics studied, content, placement, and themes, there is nothing in any of them to exclude the idea or to exclude the Epistola from Bacon's genuine corpus. In fact, there is every reason to suggest that it should be included. The incorporation of material to that found elsewhere in his work, the uniformity of the manuscripts, and the reliance on authorities that Bacon is known to have used. Now, I won't say for certain that it was written by Bacon. I certainly wasn't there when it was written, but in light of this study, I argue that the Epistola should retain its position within the corpus of Bacon's genuine works. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Megan, and thank you for leading us through this really this body of evidence that really leads to a convincing argument. I think while people are gathering their thoughts, I have a couple of questions. One, you look very closely at the internal evidence presented in the manuscripts. I'm wondering about the larger context, like particularly the readership. Like, do you know who was reading these manuscripts, who produced them, where were they being read? If you have any thoughts on that. And then my second, well, go ahead.
Oh, no, okay. This particular text, we're not quite sure why Bacon wrote it, but it was very popular, if not in the centuries immediately following his death. By the early modern period, by the 16th century, it is incredibly popular. The English polymath John Dee, who's court astronomer to Elizabeth I, is a big champion of this work. He has his own copy, and he makes a printed edition from it. He writes his own introduction to this work and talks about how Bacon was a visionary in terms of understanding the ability of art to perfect nature. So we don't know, unfortunately, we don't know a lot about its readership in the later Middle Ages, but by the early modern period, it is very popular, especially among English alchemists.
Okay, great, thank you.
We actually have a question from the chat. Yeah. So James Volkel asks, to what extent do you think that the exclusion of the Epistola was based on earlier scholars' squeamishness with its alchemical content?
That could be. I hadn't really thought about that, but it may explain why certain scholars like Singer and Thorndike were so adamant that chapters 7 and 8 were also authentic, while chapters 9 through 11 were not, whereas chapters 7 and 8, there's no good reason to cut them out. So that's something to think about.
Okay. Lindsay, you want to ask your second question, and then I have a question too. And anyone else, if you want to raise your hand or just type it in the chat, and we'll get your question too.
Sure, I'll go ahead with mine. This is a pretty simple question. You mentioned a copy that has been dated to the 13th century, which would put it pretty close to Bacon's life. But what is your evidence for, or why do you think it's not 13th century?
I'll go back to the stemma. I think it's not 13th century because this is the manuscript in question, OT. It's supposedly from the 13th century. I think it is from the 14th century or later because it relies very heavily on OM. It seems to be a copy of OM's, and OM is almost certainly a 14th century manuscript. So it just makes sense that I mean, there's no way it could be 13th century if it's a copy of a 14th century.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Just wanted some clarification on that.
Okay, great. Now, my question is, I was really interested in sort of towards the start of your talk when you were talking about the variety of texts that also appear in the manuscript and how scholars have used those texts to help say if this text is authentic or not, whether or not it's close to other Bacon texts or there are other Bacon texts in the manuscript. And I never thought about using that as a way to do that. And I look at manuscripts all the time that sort of have mixes of spurious and known to be actually by the person. But my question is actually, how much did the people who were compiling these manuscripts care about the authorship? Like, was it important to them that this was written by Bacon, or do we know?
We don't know. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't give a blanket answer. We don't know. Some of the later ones, it does seem to be important to them that it was written by Bacon. I mean, as I said earlier, by the 16th and 17th century, Bacon is a sort of point of pride among English alchemists. They like to point to him and say, he was one of our own. And so it's important to them that it would be genuinely Bacon, but yeah, I can't say much to the motivations of the other people who were compiling it, just because as of yet we don't know who was compiling most of these.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes,
Thank you.
and that particular case of using the placement of the manuscripts was very unique in that the three shorter texts that were appendices of De Retardatione always appeared in the same order immediately following De Retardatione. They had never appeared in any other context. And so it wasn't like the Epistola, which appears in manuscripts with other works, which is what I found out after doing this. But the reason that Paravicini Baliani was able to say that they were almost certainly not genuine is because they had never been found anywhere else except for immediately following De Retardatione. And then when De Retardatione was proved to be not by Bacon, then there was no reason to assume the others were by Bacon as well.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. All right, we have another question from chat. Sarah Nuria, how practical is the alchemy in chapters 9 through 11? Are they recipes or more theoretical? And then she adds, this was an absolutely wonderful paper. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. Yes, that is actually part of what distinguishes chapters 9 through 11 is it is very practical. He gives instructions. And that's not something that occurs in the rest of the epistola. So, for instance, in chapter 6, when Bacon talks about different machines you can make, or different war weapons that you can use, like a Greek fire, he never tells you how to make them. He just says it is possible to make them. So he talks about a self-moving chariot, and a flying machine, and a thing that can lift up great weights while being very small. And he never says how to make any of these things. He just says they're possible. But then you move to chapters, even the chapter on the prolongation of life, he doesn't really talk about how to prolong life, which he does in other places. He just says it's possible. But then you move to chapters 9 through 11, and he gives very explicit instructions on how to make the philosopher's egg. In fact, the 3 chapters are 3 different recipes, all for making the philosopher's egg.
Has anyone made the philosopher's egg successfully using his instructions?
I have not, but it's something that I would like to try, just to see what happens when you combine the ingredients. I mean, it's very interesting, but I come from a school where we do alchemical replications, and you can learn a lot about pre-modern chemistry by replicating the alchemical processes that they used. You can do things like discuss. So as I say, a lot of these substances are written in code name, and you can figure out what they are by doing chemical replications. So that is something that I will eventually get around to, probably when I do the edition of this text.
Cool. All right. Are there any more questions? or comments? Lynn, do you want to, shall we close, or do you have any other questions?
No, I don't have any other questions or comments, except just to say thank you very much for this really stimulating paper on a Friday afternoon. Just checking to make sure there aren't any more. So thank you, Megan, for presenting this. And thank you everyone for coming. I did put the links in the chat that I said that I would put in the chat at the beginning, and they're there now. Otherwise, we will say goodbye, so long. Have a great weekend and a great Friday afternoon. And hopefully see you on April 14th for Andrew Turner's lecture.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.